I've buried 3 people in my life. My father went first, quiet the way he lived, sitting in his favorite chair with a cold cup of coffee and the evening news, still talking to no one. My wife, Eleanor, followed years later, after a long and dignified fight with cancer that she carried with more grace than I've ever seen in another human being. And then there's my son. Only, my son wasn't dead. I was the only man in that church who knew it. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 67 years old. My left knee aches when the weather turns, and I've got a small collection of bourbon I pretend I don't care too much about. I live in a quiet house, just outside Chicago, the kind of place where mornings come slow, and the coffee always tastes better when you don't have anywhere to be. My son, Daniel Hayes, built a life most men would be proud of. He stood a little over 6 feet, carried himself with that calm confidence you don't notice at first, but trust immediately once you do. He built Hayes Capital from nothing more than 2 desks and a rented office into something real, something steady. He did it the right way too, which in a city like Chicago is almost suspicious. No shortcuts, no noise, just patience and work. Every Sunday morning, like clockwork, he called me. 7:30 sharp. Not 7:29, not 7:31, 7:30. We'd talk about nothing and everything. Weather, work, football. The kind of conversations that don't feel important until you imagine not having them anymore. About 8 months ago, those calls started to change. Nothing obvious. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who made a scene out of trouble. But I've known him his whole life, and there are things you don't need words for. You feel them, like a shift in the foundation of a house you've lived in for decades. One Sunday, the phone rang early. 6:15. That alone was enough to tell me something wasn't right. I answered, and before I could say much of anything, he said, "Dad, I need to show you something. Can I come by?" He drove out from the city that morning. 40 minutes that felt longer than it should have. He sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he never touched, and a folder in his hands like it weighed more than it should. I watched him for a moment before opening it. There were bank statements, transfer records, numbers moving in ways numbers aren't supposed to move when everything's honest. "How long?" I asked. He leaned back slightly, eyes steady but tired in a way I hadn't seen before. 4 months confirmed, he said. Probably longer. I didn't need him to say the name. "Emily," I said. He nodded once. "Now, I want to be clear about something. I never disliked my daughter-in-law because she married my son. I disliked her because from the very beginning, there was something about her that felt performed. You ever meet someone whose smile arrives just a second too late? Like they're deciding to smile instead of feeling it? That was Emily. Always warm when people were watching. Always just distant enough when they weren't. Daniel loved her, completely. The way good men love women who understand exactly where their blind spots are. They'd been married 6 years. No children. She said it was a choice. I always suspected it was something else. The name in the file was Michael Carter. Mid-30s. Finance background. The kind of man who walks into a room already convinced he belongs there. The kind of man who rarely hears the word no from anyone who matters. Daniel had been building this quietly, alone, just like we do. I closed the folder and looked at my son. For a moment, I didn't see the man who built a company. I saw the boy who used to fall off his bike and refused to cry until he thought I wasn't looking. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just a second. Because I needed to be sure," he said. Once I said it out loud, it becomes real. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. We sat there in silence for a while. Then I asked the only question that mattered. "So what's the plan?" And for the first time since he walked through my door, Daniel smiled. Not big, just enough. "I'm going to need you at my funeral," he said. I studied him for a long moment, waiting for the rest of it. It came. Slow. Controlled. "I want them to think I'm gone," he said. "I want them comfortable. I want them talking." That's the moment I understood something important. My son wasn't reacting. He was preparing. And whatever he had in mind, it wasn't small. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to feel something shift that you can't quite explain, Then you already know where this is going. Stick with me? Because what happened next, it's not something you see coming the first time. Daniel didn't rush into anything. That's the first thing you need to understand about my son. He wasn't impulsive. Never had been. Even as a boy, he'd sit back and watch before making a move, like he was studying the room for something the rest of us couldn't see yet. So, when he told me he wanted to attend his own funeral, I knew this wasn't anger talking. This was calculation, the kind that takes time, the kind that doesn't leave loose ends. He came back the following evening with a plan that was already taking shape, not just an idea, but something with structure, with people, with contingencies. There were two names he trusted enough to bring into this. The first was his attorney, Laura Bennett, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who spoke like every sentence had already been cross-examined in her head before it reached the room. The second was Dr. Andrew Collins, an old college friend of Daniel's. Now, a physician with the kind of calm demeanor you only see in people who have spent years around life and death without flinching. Daniel explained it to me slowly, piece by piece, making sure I understood not just what would happen, but why it had to happen this way. The financial case against Emily and Michael was already strong, but not complete. Transfers, shell accounts, layered transactions. Enough to raise suspicion, not enough to end it cleanly. What he needed was something undeniable, something spoken, something that would remove any space for explanation or escape. People talk when they think they've won, he said to me that night, sitting at the same kitchen table. And Michael, he's the kind of man who needs to hear himself talk. I didn't argue with him. I had met men like that before, too confident to stay quiet, too proud to walk away clean. The medical part was the piece that made me pause, if I'm being honest. Dr. Collins had access to a compound that could lower Daniel's vital signs to levels that would be read, even by trained professionals, as cardiac death. Temporary. Controlled. Reversible. I remember staring at my son longer than I should have after he explained it. You're asking me to watch them put you in a box, I said. He didn't look away. I'm asking you to trust me, he replied. That was harder than anything else he'd said so far. Not because I didn't trust him, but because trust looks different when it asks something of you. Still, I nodded. Because that's what you do when your son looks at you like that. The funeral home director, a man named Henry Wallace, had known our family for decades. He handled the conversation with a kind of quiet professionalism that told me nothing we were asking him to do was entirely new to him, even if the details were unusual. The coffin would be modified, hidden oxygen supply, temperature control, a monitor transmitting to Dr. Collins's phone, and a microphone. Small, invisible, unless you knew where to look. They'll say something, Daniel repeated more than once in those days. Not right away. But when the room feels safe, they'll say something. My role in all of this was simple on paper. Sit in the front row. Grieve. Convincingly. I told him I didn't need to practice that part. Losing Eleanor had already taught me everything I needed to know about what real grief looks like. All I had to do now was aim it in the right direction. The days leading up to the funeral were quieter than I expected. Daniel stayed in a controlled medical environment under Dr. Collins' supervision. Laura handled the legal groundwork, moving faster than I would have thought possible without making noise. And Emily played her part perfectly. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have believed her. The way she spoke, the way she held herself, the way she leaned into people just enough to let them feel her grief without ever losing control of it. I watched her at the house 2 nights before the service, standing in my living room, telling a neighbor how sudden it all was. Her voice cracked at exactly the right moment. Her eyes filled just enough. It was impressive. I'll give her that. Michael kept his distance publicly. Sent flowers. Called once. Spoke in that careful, measured tone of a man who understands appearances better than emotions. But I could see it, even through the phone. The confidence. The sense that whatever game he thought he was playing, he believed he had already won it. The night before the funeral, Daniel called me. Not through his phone. Through Dr. Collins. His voice was steady. You ready? He asked. I looked around my house, at the chair Eleanor used to sit in, at the kitchen table where Daniel had grown up, at the quiet that had settled into my life long before any of this started. No, I said honestly, but I'll be there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I didn't expect. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't react too early. I let out a breath. Son, if you cough from inside that coffin, I can't promise anything. He almost laughed. Almost. Just give me a few seconds, he said. We hung up after that. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid of what might go wrong, but because I understood exactly what had to go right. The next morning, I put on the black suit Eleanor had picked out years ago, the one I had worn when we buried her. It still fit the same. That felt strange, in a way I can't fully explain. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment before leaving, not checking my tie, not fixing anything. Just looking, trying to prepare myself to sit in a room full of people mourning a man who wasn't dead, trying to prepare myself to watch my son lie still while the woman he loved and the man who betrayed him stood just a few feet away, and say nothing. By the time I stepped into the church that morning, I had already made peace with one thing. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. If you think you already know how this ends, you don't. Because what happened inside that church, it didn't just expose a betrayal. It changed everything I thought I understood about truth, about loyalty, and about the kind of silence a man carries before he decides to break it. The service was set for late morning, but I arrived early. I always do. Old habit from years of showing up before anyone else so I could think in a quiet room before the noise began. Street. Matthews looked the same as it always had. Tall ceilings, polished wood, light coming in through stained glass like it had nowhere else to be. Peaceful, if you didn't know what was about to happen inside it. By the time the doors opened, people were already gathering. Colleagues, clients, neighbors, men in suits who respected Daniel, women who remembered him as the polite young man who never forgot a name. He had built something real in that city, and you could see it in the way people showed up, not out of obligation, out of respect. I took my place in the front pew, same spot I sat when we buried Eleanor. That felt heavier than I expected. Emily sat 2 seats away from me, dressed in black that was tasteful enough to look effortless and expensive enough to remind you it wasn't. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, fingers still, posture perfect. She leaned into people when they spoke to her, nodded at the right moments, allowed her voice to soften just enough to suggest it might break if pushed any further. It was a performance, a good one. Michael arrived a few minutes later and took a seat several rows back. He kept his distance, just like a man should if he were nothing more than a casual acquaintance. But he wasn't, and the way he carried himself gave that away if you knew where to look. Calm, controlled, not grieving, watching. I noticed everything that morning. When you're sitting in a church pretending your son is dead, your mind doesn't wander. It sharpens. Every movement, every glance, every small shift in someone's expression becomes something you hold on to. The service began, and for a while, it felt real. Hymns were sung, words were spoken. Stories were told about a man who, for everyone else in that room, had truly been lost. I listened to people describe my son as kind, disciplined, generous. One man talked about how Daniel had helped him keep his business afloat during a rough year and never mentioned it again. A woman I didn't recognize cried harder than anyone else in the room. Later, I would learn he had been quietly paying for her daughter's tuition. That part got to me, because no matter what we were doing that day, none of that was fake. That was who he was. Emily spoke during the service. I'll give her this, she committed fully. Her voice trembled just enough. She paused in the right places. She painted a picture of a husband who had meant everything to her. Anyone who didn't know better would have believed every word. I watched her carefully the entire time. Not the words. The spaces between them. That's where the truth usually hides. Michael never spoke. He didn't need to. Men like him don't waste words unless there's something to gain from them. He sat back, hands folded, eyes lowered just enough to look respectful without ever appearing weak. Once, just once, he looked up and caught my eye. He gave me a slow, solemn nod, the kind a man gives when he wants to be seen as decent. I nodded back. And in my mind I thought, enjoy the next few minutes. The service ended, and people began to move. Hands were shaken, shoulders were touched, words were offered, most of them the same, because there are only so many things people know how to say when death is involved. I accepted every one of them the way a grieving father should. Calm, quiet, thankful, even as I stood just a few feet away from a coffin that did not contain a dead man. Eventually, the crowd thinned. That's always how it goes. The room that felt so full just minutes ago begins to empty until what's left is something more intimate. Family. Or at least the version of it that exists on paper. Emily stayed close to the front. Her sister hovered nearby. A cousin of Daniel's stood off to the side, still wiping tears from her face. And then there was Michael. He moved forward slowly, naturally, like he had every right to be there. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. That's the thing about confidence. It opens doors that should stay closed. I stood beside the coffin, one hand resting on the polished wood. I spoke quietly, the way a father does when he thinks he's saying goodbye. Not for anyone else, just for him. Or at least that's what it looked like. I could feel the room behind me. The shift in presence. The subtle change in air when someone steps too close. And then, I felt him before I heard him. The faint scent of cologne. The slight displacement of space. Michael leaned in, close enough that his voice wouldn't carry beyond me. "Don't worry," he said softly, almost kindly. "I'll take better care of what he left behind than he ever did." I didn't move. Not a single muscle. My hand stayed on the coffin. My eyes stayed forward. But inside, I counted. 1, 2, 3. Because Daniel had told me to give him a few seconds. And in that silence, in that church, in that moment where everything felt like it was holding its breath, something inside that coffin shifted. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not yet. But I felt it. And I knew. We were no longer waiting. If you've ever watched a man walk confidently into a moment he believes he controls, only to realize too late that he never did, then you already understand what was about to happen next. Stay with me. Because what came after that? No one in that room was ready for it. There's a kind of silence that settles over a room just before something breaks it. Not the comfortable kind. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that feels like the air itself is waiting. That's the silence we were standing in when it happened. My hand was still resting on the coffin. Michael was still beside me, close enough that I could hear his breathing, steady, confident, untouched by doubt. For a man like him, this was the end of the story. He thought he was standing at the finish line. He didn't know he'd just stepped onto the stage. Then it came. A small sound. Barely anything, really. A short, involuntary cough from inside the coffin. Not loud, not dramatic. But in that silence, it might as well have been thunder. Michael froze. Not the kind of freeze where a man flinches or pulls back. This was different. Everything in him just stopped. Breath. Movement. Thought. As if something inside him understood before his mind could catch up. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't turn. I didn't react. I let the moment stretch, just long enough to feel it take hold of the room. Then, quietly, I said, "You might want to stay right where you are." The lid didn't burst open. That would have been too easy. Too sudden. Daniel had never been a man for theatrics without purpose. No. The lid moved slowly, deliberately, rising inch by inch, like a door being opened for someone who needed to see exactly what was waiting on the other side. Every eye in that room found it at the same time. You could feel it. The shift from confusion to something deeper, something colder. The lid lifted halfway, then a little more. And then, my son sat up. Just like that. Calm, controlled, alive. His suit still perfect. His face pale but returning to color by the second. His eyes clear and focused as they landed exactly where they needed to. On Michael. The sound that followed wasn't one sound. It was many. A scream from Emily's sister, sharp and uncontrolled. A gasp from somewhere behind us. Someone dropped something. I never saw what. A man whispered something under his breath that didn't belong in a church. Daniel didn't look at any of them. Not yet. He swung his legs over the side of the coffin, steady, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. Doctor. Collins appeared from the side aisle right on cue, offering a hand that Daniel accepted more out of timing than necessity. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and for a moment, just stood there, breathing, present, real. "Hey, Dad," he said, like he had just walked into the room. I turned to him then, really looked at him, and I felt something move through me that I won't pretend I can explain properly. Relief, yes. Pride, more than that. And something else, something deeper. "You're early," I said. His mouth twitched slightly, almost a smile. I heard what he said. I gave a small nod. "I figured you might." Then he turned, slowly. And now, finally, he looked at her. Whatever mask she had been wearing all morning, it was gone. Not cracked. Gone. What replaced it wasn't grief. It wasn't even fear, not at first. It was calculation, cold, immediate, instinctive, the kind that tells you exactly who someone is when they don't have time to choose it. Daniel held her gaze for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then he looked away, like he had already gotten his answer. Michael hadn't moved. He was still standing beside me, but the man who had leaned in with quiet confidence just moments ago, he wasn't there anymore. This was someone else. Someone trying very hard to understand a reality that no longer made sense. Daniel stepped toward him. Slow, measured. Each step intentional. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that there was no confusion about who he was addressing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Michael opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "That's all right," Daniel continued, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You don't have to say anything." A pause. Just long enough. "You've already said everything that matters." And right on time, like a line delivered in a play that had been rehearsed perfectly, the side door opened. Laura Bennett walked in first, composed as ever, a folder in her hand. Behind her were two federal agents. You could tell what they were the moment you saw them. Not by uniforms. By posture. By the way, they moved like they already knew exactly where they needed to be. They didn't rush. They didn't raise their voices. They simply stepped into the room and let the reality of their presence settle in. Michael looked at them, then back at Daniel, then toward the door, like a man briefly considering whether movement was still an option. "I wouldn't," I said quietly. He turned toward me, and in that moment, I saw it. The understanding. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to know that whatever he thought he had been part of, it was over. Laura opened the folder with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "Michael Carter," she said, her tone even. "These are federal charges related to wire fraud, financial conspiracy, and asset concealment." She set the documents in front of him, though he didn't reach for them. "You have the right to remain silent," one of the agents added, stepping forward just enough to make it clear this was no longer a conversation. Michael didn't resist. He didn't argue. Men like him don't fall apart loudly. They collapse inward, quietly, completely. As they led him away, he looked back once. Not at me. Not at the room. At Daniel. As if trying to understand how he had misread the entire situation so badly. Daniel met his gaze without anger. Without satisfaction. Just calm. "I hope you figure out what you were really after," he said. "Because it wasn't the money." The doors closed behind them. And just like that, the room exhaled. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because what we thought was the end was only the beginning of something none of us had seen coming. The room didn't go back to normal after they took Michael out. People like to believe moments like that end cleanly. Like a door closing and everything on the other side staying there. That's not how it works. What's left behind is quieter, heavier. The kind of silence that makes people look at each other without knowing what to say. Daniel stood there for a moment after the doors shut, his shoulders steady, his breathing even, like he had already stepped past the hardest part. Laura moved off to the side, speaking softly with the agents who remained, her voice low and controlled, already shifting into whatever came next. "Doctor." Collins guided the rest of the room out with a calm hand on shoulders and quiet reassurances that sounded just convincing enough to be believed. One by one, people left until it was just us. Me, my son, and Emily. She hadn't moved. Not since the moment Daniel sat up. Not since the moment everything she had built came apart in front of her. She stood there with her hands at her sides. No performance left to hold on to. When Daniel finally turned to her, it wasn't with anger. That surprised me more than anything else that day. It wasn't softness either. It was something in between, something quieter. "It's over," he said. She swallowed, slow, like the words had to pass through something heavy before they reached her. "No," she replied, almost to herself. "Not yet." He didn't step closer. Didn't raise his voice. "There's nothing left to protect," he said. That's when she looked at me. Not at him. At me. And I knew, right then, that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be about money. "I need you here for this," she said. Her voice had changed. No tremble, no careful softness. Just direct. I didn't answer. I just stayed where I was. Because sometimes the only thing you can do is listen. She took a breath. Not to steady herself. To decide. "My name isn't Emily Carter," she said. "It's Emily Brooks." The name didn't mean anything to Daniel. I could see that immediately. But it landed somewhere else. Somewhere older. Somewhere I hadn't visited in a long time. She watched my face as she spoke, like she was measuring something. "My father was Thomas Brooks," she continued. "He ran a small investment fund years ago. It collapsed. People lost everything." She paused. Just long enough. "You testified against him." The words settled into the room slowly. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. Daniel looked at me then. Really looked. I didn't move. I didn't speak right away. Because there are moments in a man's life where silence isn't hesitation. It's recognition. "That was a long time ago," I said carefully. "It doesn't make it less real," she replied. There was no anger in her voice. That's what made it heavier. Anger burns fast. This had been carried. For years. "I was 17, she said. "When he went to prison. When we lost the house. When everything changed." Daniel's expression shifted, just slightly. Not confusion. Not yet. Something closer to understanding that hadn't fully formed. "So this was all?" he started. She nodded once. "At first," she said. "Yes." The room felt smaller then. Like the walls had moved in just enough to make every word matter more. "I found out who you were," she said, looking at me again. "Then I found out about him." A glance toward Daniel, and I thought, maybe this was how things balance out. Daniel let out a slow breath. "Balance," he repeated. Not mocking. Not agreeing. Just testing the word. She looked at him then, and for the first time, since I had known her, I believed what I was seeing. "That was the plan," she said. "At the beginning." He didn't speak. He waited. And that's when something in her changed. Not a collapse. Not a breakdown. Just a small fracture in something that had been held together too tightly for too long. "I didn't plan on you," she said quietly. "I didn't plan on any of it feeling real." The words hung there. Fragile. Unprotected. Daniel looked at her for a long time. Long enough that I almost stepped in. Almost. But I didn't. Because whatever this was, it belonged to them now. "Did you love me?" he asked. No anger. No edge. Just the question. She didn't answer right away. She could have lied. She had been good at that. But she didn't. "Yes," she said. Not at first. But yes. Laura, standing off to the side, didn't write that down. I noticed that. Some things don't belong in a record. Daniel nodded once. Not like he was satisfied. Not like he was relieved. Just like he had heard what he needed to hear. "It doesn't change anything," she added quickly. "I know that." "No," he said. "It doesn't." And that was the end of it. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just done. We left the church not long after. The air outside felt different. Lighter in a way that didn't make sense after a day like that. Daniel came back to the house with me. Didn't say much on the drive. Didn't need to. We've always been good at silence. The kind that doesn't ask questions it isn't ready to hear answers to. He sat at the kitchen table later that afternoon, the same place where this all started. This time, he drank the coffee, both hands around the mug, like he was holding on to something steady. "I'll be all right," he said after a while. I looked at him, not as the boy he had been, not even as the man everyone else saw, but as my son. "I know," I said, and I meant it. Sunday morning came like it always does. Quiet. Predictable. The kind of morning that doesn't care what happened the week before. The phone rang just before 7:30. A little early. I answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad. You're early," I said. There was a small pause. Then a faint smile in his voice. "Didn't want to keep you waiting." We talked for a while. About nothing important. Which, if you've lived long enough, you understand is everything. If you've ever trusted someone with your whole life, only to find out there was a story behind them you never saw, then you already understand this part better than most. The truth is, some things don't end when they're exposed. They just become clearer. And clarity, whether you want it or not, is its own kind of closure. If this story stayed with you even a little, take a second to subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories like this, real ones, the kind that don't always end the way you expect, but always leave you thinking long after they're over.